Hello and welcome to the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast, which is a platform for giving a voice to our patrons. My name is Andrew Snyder, and I am the host of the show, as well as the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast, and I warmly welcome you to join us around our hearth. First of all, I'm going to start posting my interviews to YouTube, and so if you're watching the video of this, then know that this will cut to the actual video of the conversation once I finish this intro. This is the first conversation that our fellowship is having on the Poetic Edda, which is one of our chief sources of information on Norse mythology and legends. Now, to my knowledge, we're all amateurs here regarding this particular collection of text. I believe that all of us are reading it or have just finished reading it for this purpose. But Mythic Mind patrons tend to generally be drawn to this kind of material, as the name suggests. And so, although we don't have any particular expertise here, I believe that we are off to a good start in providing some important and fun conversations on this material that is so fascinating and that is really foundational to some of the rather important minds of our time. People like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and obviously beyond. Today we're going to be discussing the first two sections of the Poetic Edda, the Voluspa and the Havamal, and I really hope that you enjoy this even a fraction as much as I did. Alright, so welcome back to the latest patron chat as we begin our series in talking about the Poetic Edda, which is one of the main sources of information we have about Norse myths and legends. Now, none of us here are experts by any means on this material. We're reading it for the first time, or we've read it for the first time for this purpose, or maybe even you haven't read it at all and you're just here along for the ride. And so the purpose of this is really just to be fellow travelers in these uncharted waters and see what glories we can uncover. But before we get into the conversation, I'd like to just, for everyone to just introduce yourself, and so everybody knows exactly who it is that we're listening to. And we'll start with Thomas, who of course is a recurring guest, but you can remind us briefly of who you are and what you have going on.
Hey, yeah. So I'm sure your listeners are tired of hearing about me because I've been on so many times, but I am a children's book author, a freelance writer, and a podcaster. I've got more stuff going on right now than I think I'm able to juggle all at once, but that's fine. Although I am looking forward to next year, the publication in February of my first children's book, which is a biography of Nicholas Steno, who was a Catholic priest and also a scientist in the 17th century. He did a lot of pioneering work in geology, and I have adapted his story for middle graders, and so I'm really excited about that. I'm also a huge Tolkien fan, so I'm really happy to be discussing one of the sources of his great mythology.
Good, wonderful. Josh, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Josh. I'm funny enough, actually, I'm an accountant by day, and by night I am, well, not just by night, but all around, I am a husband and a father of two. I'm also a graduate student in a Great Books program at Memoria College right now. Also a fan of Tolkien, also reading this for the first time, definitely noticing a lot of naming conventions already and influence there, but yeah, just excited to be along for the ride.
Good, fantastic. Amanda, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am really just a housewife these days. I used to work in medicine, but I got out of that. And I've always had an interest in philosophy and theology, and I'm really just here for the ride. Interesting to note, my husband and I just finished the Return of the King movie this evening, so that was fun.
Good. And yeah, there's nothing just about that vocation. Definitely a good vocation. My wife was also in medicine before she was able to stay home. So definitely appreciate everything you have done and what you do already.
That's wonderful. That's great to hear. I feel like I'm a loner in this. So
No, well, we're definitely glad that you're here. So we are here to talk about the first couple sections of the Poetic Edda today. And so that is the Voluspa and the Havamal. Now, these both of these are difficult texts to just jump into and walk away with a clear idea of exactly what's going on. But at the same time, I mean, we can get the basic structure here, but I think it's going to be helpful for everyone, especially those of you who are not familiar with this text, to get a basic outline of this first section that we'll be taking a look at. And so I'm just going to read the summary that's provided in the Larrington translation, published by the Oxford University Press. And so that way we have a sense of the general story we're looking at, and then we'll just jump around to whatever has stood out to us in our reading. All right, so the account begins with the creation of the earth, then time is created. The gods build temples and enjoy a golden age until they are disrupted by three girls from Giant Land. This somehow leads to the creation of the dwarfs, which, by the way, side note, it's a pretty good demonstration of the density and the kind of difficulty in working with the text that even our translator here says somehow this led to the creation of the dwarfs. So it's like it's not super clear exactly how that happened. But anyways, so this somehow leads to the creation of the dwarfs. Humanity is created and the fates arrive. Now history begins. A mysterious female manifests herself among the Aesir, which the Aesir are the main group of Norse gods, a woman well versed in magic. As a consequence, the Aesir find themselves at war with the Vanir, which is another group of gods. Peace is concluded, and the gods have to repair damage to Asgard. A giant offers to rebuild the walls in a very short space of time in exchange for the sun, the moon, and Freya. The gods agree, thinking the task impossible, but the builder nearly succeeds, and Thor has to destroy him, breaking the gods' promises of safe conduct. Then we reach the present, with Odin questioning the Seeress about what is to come. The doom of the gods is signaled by the death of Balder and its consequences, the end of the world by images of punishment and social collapse. Ragnarok approaches. The world ash Yggdrasil trembles and the giants advance. Odin is killed by the wolf Fenrir. Freyr by Sturt. Thor and the Midgard serpent kill each other. Odin is avenged by his son Vidar, and the world disappears in fire. In the verses which follow, the earth rises anew, with the sea and some of the Aesir, including Balder, return to live peacefully together. In the final verse, the sinister dragon Nidhogg is seen, and the seeress sinks out of her trance. And that's where the story ends. And so Odin is basically calling forth this seeress who has died. And there's a sense in the northern mythos that the dead have more wisdom than the living because, well, they've been removed from the tumults of mortal affairs, and so they're keyed into a greater wisdom. And so he calls forth this dead seeress to get a sense of things that are to come. And through this conversation, this kind of interrogation, we get the full gambit of the Norse narrative, really going from creation, the earliest point that we have, all the way up to Ragnarok and beyond. And so there's a whole lot that's covered within this material, and I'm interested in seeing what stood out to you. Thomas or Josh, anything that you want to just throw out there? It can be from anywhere in this, just kind of wherever you want to go with this.
Well, it has to be the names of all the dwarves for me. I was like, okay, so the names of all the dwarves in The Hobbit were essentially all taken wholesale from the Voluspa. I mean, I knew that they were from Norse mythology. I didn't know that they would all be in this one text. So yeah.
Yeah. We get this list of dwarves. I mean, things like Wallen and Bomber and Thorin, and there's an Oakenshield, and even Gandalf, who is a dwarf in this text, but obviously Tolkien changes that a bit. But yeah, so he just lifts all of these dwarven names and then applies it to his story.
I mean, that makes me feel better as a writer because it means that it's okay to just lift names from stuff and you're not being uncreative by doing that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about what the exact symbolism is of the Yggdrasil tree standing above like the Erd's well? Like, do you know anything about that specifically?
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with the Urdswell, but it's tied to the fates. And so it's something about time, something about destiny, something about kind of utmost reality. And obviously Yggdrasil, it's the world tree that holds the realms together. It's basically it's something like the structure of the universe, essentially. It
Mhm.
is all in this
Hmm.
great tree. And so I assume that the Urdswell is something like I mean, it's the waters that feed into the cosmic tree. And so I assume that it has something to do with just the life force of the tree itself that these fates are tuned into. And so they're able to see where this life force of the tree is going to move into the various branches to the point where they know not only the fates of men, but they know the fates of gods as well. They know the fates of all things that live within and upon this tree. And so that's the best I can get at, not having great knowledge beyond just looking at it and thinking about it. That's
Mhm.
kind of what I'm putting together.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense to me.
I was
And
struck by
yeah, go
the
ahead.
the three fates about how and especially in the way you're describing them, Andrew, about how like in some way they're almost like above the gods themselves in the sense that they know everything about the future and about the fate of the universe and the Aesir and Vanir themselves. So it's like in a way that, and I don't know if they're older because they kind of just appear in the text, but I found them to be sort of more intriguing figures than the main gods because of the sort of mystery surrounding them.
Yeah, and so yeah, you're right. It's really not clear where they come from. I mean, it talks about this Urd's well, and then it says from there come girls. Now, does that mean they're like born out of the well, or does it just mean like that's where they live and that's where they're from? It's not super clear to me just from this text alone. Um, but yeah, we definitely do see that the gods as well as mortals are subject to fate. And I do know just from reading this as well as the Prose Edda that very often the gods are trying to thwart fate. They get some kind of revelation about what's going to happen, and so they go out of their way to try to avoid their doom. But of course, in so doing, they end up bringing it about. Uh, we see this, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about Balder and perhaps a little bit as that comes up a little bit later on in this section, when there's this revelation that Balder's going to die, and so they go out of their way to prevent it, and in so doing, they leave room for the one weakness that's going to kill him. Um, and I definitely recognize that the idea of fate, plays a very important role, really, for a lot of pagan literature, but especially within the Northern mythos. The idea of fate is so important. And this is seen in a lot of just the way that they do their storytelling. When spoilers are not really an issue, they'll tell you ahead of time that somebody's about to die, and then they'll go and tell you how they die. They give you the conclusion before you actually get there. We see this in Beowulf a lot, which that's operating in the Anglo-Saxons, but still we're still within the same region, same basic culture. And when you read Beowulf, it'll tell you that he's going to have victory before he has victory, and then it's going to tell you like basically as soon as the dragon gets introduced, it's going to tell you that this dragon is going to kill him, and then the rest of the story is the playing out of how that happens, and so for Northern storytelling, and I assume even just Northern life, there's a profound sense of fate. And so the issue is not really what's going to happen, but the issue is how are we going to relate to the fate that we can't control, right? Because, as mortals, we all have the fate of mortality. We all have the fate of death. That's what Tolkien says about Beowulf, that that's Beowulf is not a heroic lay per se, that there's a reason why Beowulf didn't have any enmeshed loyalties. He didn't get married. He didn't have kids. And that's because simply being immortal was tragedy enough. And part of his hero's journey was simply relating himself to his mortality. And so it's not so much about what's going to happen, but it's about how do you relate yourself to the fate that you can't control. And that's actually something I really appreciate about the Northern myths and legends, that there's not a big focus on like human freedom to shape time, things are going to happen the way that they're going to happen.
Mm.
And so that reorients freedom to deciding, as Gandalf says, right? We decide basically what we're going to do with the time that's given to us, recognizing the time is given to us. We don't get to create it.
So just a thought, just thinking about Norse and Vikings just historically, and all the like the chaos that they kind of endured, and the suffering really, and that suffering kind of gives a person insight, right? So it's interesting what you're saying, Andrew, because for all of the aspects of like Viking history and bloodshed, there are kind of silver linings to that, which you can see in Beowulf and in this text as well. Just because it's like that suffering kind of gives you that introspection that maybe you may not have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who, they were constantly under threat of, being attacked by neighboring tribes, by foreign peoples, people who are always struggling just to survive the winter, or, attacks by wild animals. These are people who couldn't help but to be acquainted with the reality of death, which is something that, we try to hide ourselves from because we can to a certain degree, more so than they were able to, right? I mean, eventually we all have to face mortality. We all have to face any number of sufferings that might come our way. But, given our just the world in which we live, it's a lot easier to hide ourselves from those things for longer periods of time, to the point where we're not really comfortable talking about death. We're not really comfortable talking about suffering, because as much as we can, we push it away. And when we do talk about something like death, we use euphemisms, right? We talk about like passing away, or we'll use any kind of language to soften the reality of what we're actually dealing with. Whereas, you read again, Beowulf is fresh on my mind because it's the northern text I'm most familiar with, and I teach on it now on a regular basis. But what we see there is that, the story of Beowulf is bookended on the beginning and the end by great funerals. First by shield chiefing, and then you've got Beowulf at the end. And in both of those great funerals, you see people who are willing to deal with death, in that they do sorrow, they lament passionately, but not as people without hope. You see a sense of gratitude for life because they are aware of death. And so death doesn't come to them as something strange. It's something that they can't help but to incorporate into their manner of life. And I think that there's something good about that. I think there's something that we can recover from that.
I've seen a lot of those themes in a current day adaptation of this material, because I watched my younger brother play through God of War Ragnarok, which focuses on these characters. And in the story of that video game, which is a loose adaptation of this material, the Aesir, especially Odin, are trying to come to grips with the fact that even as gods, they're mortal. They can be killed. And Odin's big driving thing that's motivating him throughout the game is, I want to know what happens to me after I die. Because he doesn't know. The Aesir don't know what happens to them after they die, and it terrifies them. And so that they're not doing what you just described, Andrew, like being having gratitude for life. Instead, they're doing everything to try and hold on to life as long as possible, stave off death, or to plumb the mysteries of the afterlife to discover what actually happens to them. Because they're like, well, when humans die, they come to us in Valhalla. Is there anything for us when we die? And I just think that it was interesting that the writers of that game have enough familiarity with the material that they are able to continue to explore that theme of mortality and death, which was so close to northern people and informed their whole cosmology and mythic cycle.
And of course, we see that very idea play out in Tolkien's Legendarium with the elves, who don't really know what happens to them in the end when Arda is remade, when Arda is destroyed. There's this question mark as to what actually becomes of them. Are they so tied with Arda that they will simply cease to be? And this is why mortality is seen as the gift of Iluvatar to mortal men, because when we die, even in Tolkien's world, which is supposed to be congruent with Christian theology, he believes that when we die, we leave the circles of this world and we essentially go to where God is. That's the fate of mortals. But whereas the elves, who are kind of more natural in the sense of being embedded within nature, there's this question mark regarding what actually happens to them. And this is when we see that the death that mortals, that humans experience, actually is a gift when seen in the right light. Whereas, yeah, to bring it back into specifically the Aesir, to the northern mythos, I mean, this whole Voluspa is Odin basically trying to get a better sense of what's going to happen so he can avoid Ragnarok, right? So he can avoid death. But that's not how fate works.
Do you ever see that? Like, it seems like something I've noticed, like, from like the Greeks and the Romans and like even the various medieval cultures, is this concept that there's so much more of like just an everyday reality to death that they seem to be aware of. Do you think that's really just like a modern and postmodern thing to be extremely uncomfortable and try to avoid the thought of death? Like just regularly, like I just kind of think like, in a world that's plagued with nihilism in a sense, of course you wouldn't want to think about death because there's no hope. But on the other hand, maybe people also don't even, it's not even like much of a reality to them because there's so much there's like so much comfort, there's so much pleasure and distraction surrounding them. It's kind of like a thought I had that like I feel like I'm always blown away by how much these different cultures were seemingly just like so comfortable with death. I kind of think of like the Stoics with like Memento Mori, right? Where it's like that was just like a regular everyday practice. And I'm like, I couldn't imagine like every day just being like, yeah, I might just die in my sleep tonight and not wake up tomorrow, right? Like that's an interesting discipline to have in a sense. But yeah, it just seems, I don't know if that was like a thing in like Enlightenment or early modernism, but it certainly seems like that's just a massive shift in the 20th century, at least compared to any of these ancient and medieval cultures.
Well, I would say that that's very true. And, without some suffering, you can't have a proper understanding of joy. And not to become a theologian, but so said Paul. So it's very interesting, yes, that we live in this world now where we have so much comfort, which was something that we strived for so long, that we have actually kind of created our own misery to a certain extent. So I think it's really important that we value aspects of what we might consider to be suffering, that we may need to sort of put ourselves through just to be able to receive the gift of joy and remember, those hardships, so that you can be more thankful, and feel the grace of everything that you've been given.
Yeah, and I think it's worth considering that if you go to the pre-modern world, whether talking about the medieval Christians or even the pre-Christian paganism, which you mentioned, there's this prevailing idea that we live within a broader reality, and the path of wisdom, the path of honor, path of glory, whatever goal it is that we're looking for, the right path involves placing ourselves in the right position within the context that exists above and beyond us, right? And so whether we're looking for the kingdom of God, or whether we're looking to honor Odin, the Allfather, or whatever, we're looking for something beyond ourselves. And so not only is there just simply the hope of afterlife, some kind of, eternal place to go beyond death, but also there's just this general sense that there's a context beyond ourself, and there is comfort in placing ourselves within that context. Whereas you move into the later modern period, into the postmodern era where we find ourselves now, and the idea of authenticity is not so much about finding our place in broader context, it's about contextualizing everything within ourselves. And once you do that, there's nowhere to go. there's no hope you could possibly have, because any hope you have is going to be entirely artificial. It's something that you just, willed into existence. And at that point, you have nothing but your own illusions or delusions, nothing but your own dreams. There's nothing to hope for. And so all you could possibly do is plug yourself into the matrix and not think about these broader questions of reality. Just try to ignore them as long as you possibly can until you can't anymore. And then I guess you die in despair and darkness. Or, like Screwtape would have us do, you just die comfortably in hospice care, never actually thinking about mortality. You just fade into death. And so I think that philosophically, theologically, we've lost so much. And again, I'm not even just saying we have to go to, I mean, obviously, I think that Christianity is true. And so I recommend the Christian answer to this question. But I still feel comfortable saying, and Lewis and Tolkien would say the same thing, that even pre-Christian paganism is at least better than what we have now. Because as Lewis says, the pagan is in many ways something like a pre-Christian, and he's eminently convertible because he at least believes in direction beyond yourself, and that's a pretty good starting place. You can have a conversation with that, but it's very difficult to offer objective hope to somebody who's entirely lost to their own subjectivity, right? This is why in The Great Divorce, Lewis's picture of hell is radical isolation, where even the home in which you live is simply a projection of your mind. I think that he's doing something very important there in the way that he sets that up. So yes, to respond to your question, yes, I do think that there are some very important philosophical differences between us and the pre-moderns, the Christians or the pagans. And I think that our technology that's led to a higher standard of living just helps us to pull ourselves in to these fake homes that we've projected out of our minds. But that's why you go to even the pagan past, and they're a lot more comfortable talking about death than we are today. So I tend to go to lecture monologue mode sometimes.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, please forgive me if I do the same.
I can definitely see how this idea of the inescapable fate is helping the Norse peoples to kind of make sense of their universe and their world, and to sort of like create a sense of purpose out of what may seem like, random events to them. If, like you said, if someone dies because they're killed by a wild animal, or someone falls in battle when like the guy who's killed, like the guy who survives is like, well, why wasn't it me? Why was it the guy next to me who was killed? And as we know from like Middle Earth, chance is not really a thing in Middle Earth, but it can seem to the human mind a lot like chance. And so they're trying to find, they've created this structure of the gods and fate and the world tree, I think at least in part to give a sense of, or at least rediscover this sense of meaning in a universe that can seem kind of harsh to them. And like there's this saying, like, and that's such a problem with the moderns too. They've we've stripped the universe of a lot of its meaning, and so it's just cold, empty space. You get you ultimately get kind of H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos, where the universe is just out to get you. It's the uncaring, the uncaring void, and that's all there is, which is different from, I think, what the Norse are doing.
Well, I think it's important to see the lessons in the trials. And I think that's something that we've kind of lost when you talk about more of a postmodern approach to kind of reality. So I think that that's very important.
Right. And the idea that you can have a hope, that you can have a path of meaning through suffering, was tied to this idea again that there is a broader context beyond yourself, that your suffering itself is nested within a grander reality. It's just one part of the tree. And what Tom was saying about space, I mean, again, obviously that makes me think of Lewis, if you've read the Ransom series, that space is the wrong name.
Yes.
And I've referenced this many times, many different places, but in The Discarded Image, Lewis brings up the fact that the medieval Medieval man looks up at the night sky, and what he sees is not space. What he sees is substance in which his mind can rest, which is different than the modern man who goes out on a starry night and he looks up and he sees not an answer, but he sees a question mark. He sees space. He sees emptiness. He looks into the abyss, and the abyss looks back into him. And so he just feels a sense of despair, of radical smallness with nowhere to go. And so the modern looks at space and then sees our existence as just, living on this rock floating through the void that's inevitably going to dwindle into nothingness. And that's the only context that there is, which is, again, very different from the pre-moderns, where they're talking about the medievals or the pre-Christian pagans. They look out at the heavens and they see substance, they see order, they see gods, they see angels, they see something beyond themselves in which they can find their place.
Something to mention just as an aside, because I like physics as well, but there is this concept called the ether, and it was a concept that kind of fell out of fashion with Einstein, but is kind of, I don't know, there are a couple of people that are kind of like coming back to this. So it's like the idea that there is actually something there, so it's the whole like idea of like dark matter and things like that. So I think maybe, but I'm just conjecturing, maybe we will end up finding out that there is something there and we could not perceive it.
I think that's true, because like, especially when they say like, what is it, like something around 90% of the universe is dark matter, and dark energy is not normal matter that we can measure and quantify, but this exotic matter that we can't even really grasp yet with our limited instruments. And so it's, yeah, like the medieval and classical idea of ether doesn't seem so crazy anymore.
Yeah, and I'm no physicist, and so beyond what the ancient Greeks did with the ether, I can't really dial into that conversation just out of my expertise. But I am very comfortable just saying with Shakespeare that there's more in heaven and earth, O Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. That's a line that I go to on a regular basis. That just reminds me of the fact that we have no idea what we don't know. And so, we need to have, whether you're doing science, whether you're doing philosophy, whatever, we need to have a great deal of humility, recognizing that we live in a cosmos that, we only have a fraction of an understanding of, and who knows what else we might discover, or who knows what else is happening that we'll never discover. And I think that humility, for one thing, I think it's just existentially helpful. It gives us a sense of enchantment and wonder. But also, I think it's even scientifically helpful in the sense of provoking the right kinds of questions and exploration, which again is something that you see in the pagans. They're constantly trying to go out and explore and develop a better understanding of the world in which they live, which I think that is a better position than simply saying science says this or that. Because the truth is, science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And so,
as someone with a science background, I hate when scientists and science promoters will say stuff like that. Science says, or trust or science is right. Like believe the science. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like,
I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Yeah, because I'm like, wait a minute.
I'm not in science anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. I'm like, scientific knowledge is provisional, guys. When did we forget that?
Yeah, and it's all about the data too. So it's how you choose to kind of frame it. So what we know, I mean, it's just like when the earth was flat and then we found that it was round. There will be many things that time is the great equalizer.
Yeah, I'm going to start telling my students when they question me, just trust the philosophy.
Oh.
All right. I think that's a good detour, but kind of bringing it back to this text. Anything else that stands out to you? Well, for one thing, just a little bit past where we were just discussing, we do get to Balder, and he's someone I think that's worth discussing. Um, he's a very interesting figure, and he's one of those figures who, as a dying and rising god, he's one of those figures where the History Channel, documentary will pop in and say that, this is where we get the origins of the Christ story, right? You have all these examples of dying, rising god. You got Balder, you got your Osiris, and the Christians are just kind of recapitulating these same pagan ideas, right? Um, but it is interesting, I think, the connections we get in these mythological stories to, what we would call the true myth of the gospel. In that, I mean, you do have here in Balder, you have a god who's associated with like beauty and light and glory and all these positive things, who dies. He descends to the place of the dead, and we're told that in the end, he's going to come forth as part of the renewal of the world. And so we do, I think, get some Christological imagery here, before Christ, assuming the story goes back that far, which it likely does. Um, but I really like the way that, Lewis and Tolkien and whatnot talk about Balder when Lewis addresses this in Myth Became Fact, when he says that some people will bring up something like Balder in order to discredit Christianity. But then Lewis turns back and says, if the Christian gospel is true, then would we not expect to find shadows of this reality? Would we not expect to find that, the story of creation kind of rises up in even pre-Christian human understanding, that it is part of the fibers of reality. And so we would not expect that it would come up as visions and dreams and shadows. And of course, at that time, we pull in some Platonic language about shadow and fulfillment. But yeah, Amanda.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So, with regard to this text, when was it actually like the manuscript, like the original? When what is that dated? What is the date on that?
Oh, let me see real quickly.
And the only reason I asked that question is because I wonder, because it was oral tradition, right? It wasn't, I don't think that the Norse, they were very oral tradition, right? So when it was actually the manuscript, the original manuscript that this may have been from, may have been a time that was, what was it, at AD or BC? Do we know? Because I would be interested to know that, because there may have been some Christian influence. You know what I'm saying? If it is AD and not BC.
Yeah, I mean, the manuscript that we have comes from somewhere around the 13th century AD, which would be really around the time when Christianity was starting to take root in these people. And so it's possible. I mean, most people think that these stories within the Edda, especially the main stories, like Baldur is a pretty important story, that this would have been around a good while before Christianity. And so was there some influence? I mean, maybe. I don't think we can say for sure. At the same time, I tend to think that some of these myths, like the Osiris myth, like the Baldur myth of the dying and rising god, that they do come about even before they had direct access to Christian revelation. But again, I mean, it's not always super easy to draw those lines. But again, if the story of creation, the story of redemption, the meta narrative is about the the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and all that entails, you work that out into the cosmic narrative of creation, fall, redemption, then I think that we should very much expect to see that story working its way up in the human imagination as that which we are all drawn toward, simply as God's image bearers living in God's creation that are in tune to the great story. And so yeah, I don't know. I find it interesting at the very least. Um, and in the story of Balder, even setting aside the, bringing it together with Christ, we do get another example of here of the gods trying to deny fate. And so Balder and Freya get this dream that Balder is going to die. And so Freya gets an oath from every object on Earth that it's not going to harm Baldur. Except, of course, she misses one thing. She doesn't get an oath from mistletoe. And so the gods develop this game because they think that Baldur can't be hurt by anything that touches him, where they just like throw stuff at him. We see this in the Prose Edda, and so I'm getting a little bit outside of our text here, but they develop this game where they just throw stuff at him because they know nothing can hurt him. But then Loki, the trickster, gives either, depending on the story, an arrow or a spear to Hodor, who's the blind god. And so he takes this weapon made of mistletoe, and he's part of this throw things at Baldur game. And so he throws a spear or whatever of mistletoe at Baldur, and that's what kills him. And then he descends into Hell, Hel, and the place of the dead, where he's going to await. But there's also this prophecy that after Ragnarok, he, as well as Hodor, who killed him, are going to rise again. They're going to be reunited, and that they're going to be part of this kind of remaining force that's going to basically rebuild the world. Yeah, I don't know. Anything else that you have to say about Baldur?
I was wondering if we know if the Norse believed in an eternally perpetuating cycle of creation and Ragnarok, or was it just supposed to happen once? Because I've heard conflicting stuff about that.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's not super clear. And so, at the end of this vision that we receive here, we're told that Nidhogg is present, which Nidhogg is this dragon that eats corpses at the roots of Yggdrasil, not this nice paragon of goodness and virtue. That this is basically a demon of sorts. Yet it seems to be there at the end, and even Larrington at the end of her introduction here says it's not really clear if Nidhogg appearing is like this is just the vision ending, and now we're becoming reacquainted with the evil that's still around us, or is this like they're still enduring evil even after Ragnarok? It's not really clear what's happening in the narrative there. And so is there this continuation of rebirths and destructions, or is it final? I don't know that that's super clear, at least based off what I've seen. So it's a good question.
Also, too, I was struck that this appears to be Ragnarok. It appears to be the inspiration for Tolkien's Daggerwrath, a sort of Christianized Ragnarok, or really a Tolkienized Ragnarok, which is like it's almost like combining, the apocalypse with the doom of the gods, where it's like the final battle between the Valar and a reborn Morgoth, and so it including heroic, not like non-god, like mortal characters as well. And I find it interesting that text did not make it into the final published Silmarillion. Christopher Tolkien seemed to have made a conscious choice to leave it out. But I wonder what Tolkien's intention would have been, because I know he struggled for many years to publish the Silmarillion, and it never happened during his lifetime. And I'm just wondering if that really like Norse inspired end of the world text, if that was part of his vision for a complete Silmarillion. I don't know.
Yeah, that would definitely be interesting. And of course, Lewis drew heavily on Ragnarok as well for the ending of the last battle, and a lot of the imagery that we're given there, about even the moon being shattered, and just a lot of the imagery there pulls directly from the idea of Ragnarok. Yet in both of those cases, obviously we are dealing with a definitive final end at that point in final renewal. But it's interesting how much someone like Tolkien latched on to Ragnarok and this cosmic renewal for not just imagination, but he saw this as a vehicle for communicating Christian truth. It gave him his basic eschatology, right? It's the idea of the long defeat followed by eucatastrophe, that all things are in the long run. I mean, they're drawing to a close. And you find this when you read the Norse myths and legends. When you read even things that are generally in this climate, like your Beowulf, there's this idea that yes, heroes now need to fight for that which is worth defending. They need to secure the mead halls. They need to keep the fires burning, drive back the forces of darkness. But there's this expectation that in the end, they're all going to die. That in the end, we're headed for the consumption of winter. That eventually all things are going to fade away. But there's also this at least vague hope that once all good things fade away, there is going to be this sudden, unexpected renewal. There is going to be this hope. And Tolkien looked at that and thought that he saw essentially a Christian revelation there, even if, as Lewis says, that in Paralandra, that he looked at pagan mythologies and he finally recognized what they were, that they're glimmers of celestial strength and glory that have fallen on a jungle of imbecility. And so, there's a lot that's wrong with paganism. And so I'm not saying we need to be pagans, but at the same time, what's I think more remarkable is that there's a lot right about paganism. It just needs to be brought back into the right context. It needs to be baptized. It needs to be brought back into the right context. And so there's a lot in the Ragnarok story that I think does actually suit really well with Christian theology, about the fact that our ultimate hope is not for this earth, but it is for this earth renewed.
I think that's a very
No,
sorry,
I
was like, I think that's a very fair assertion. I actually can agree with that. So yeah.
Yeah. And actually, I guess I don't really need to say anything else about that. Anything else that anyone wants to bring up from the Voluspa?
There's kind of something I'm always curious of when I'm reading anything of sort like a pagan sort, but do you have any idea like what exactly like their first principles of metaphysics would be like in this culture? Like what like do they have any conception of something that transcends beyond like Odin, Freya, Thor, and like some like the primary gods?
It seems like when you're reading the pagans, whether the Norse, the Greeks, Romans, whoever, you're really dealing fundamentally with one plane of existence, right? Where the gods aren't really different from us, other than that they've got some superpowers and they live longer. But you don't have the kind of transcendence that you get in Christianity, that you get in Judaism, that you even get in Islam, the monotheistic religions, right? They all have this sense of transcendence, that there is a deity that stands in a different realm of being and is more fundamental than the world that we know through sense experience. Whereas you say the pagans, and for the most part, they don't have that kind of transcendence. They just have humans and superhumans of sorts. But we're all on one basic plane of reality, right? I mean, the gods of Greece, they live on Mount Olympus. Eventually, they kind of get conflated with the stars, and so they get a better home. But we're still dealing with the same realm of being. So true with the Norse, right? The gods, men, the dead, they all live within the same tree, right? They're all within Yggdrasil. And so, yeah, I guess their metaphysics is, to some extent, is tied into their physics. It's all just sort of one reality.
I would just say that the one unifier that I could find would just be the heavens themselves. At least from, before, like, where you're talking pre-modern, a concept, an idea of like the celestial heavens. Like you could say that would be like something that they could, that the kind of mythology and then Christianity could kind of meld as one for a period of time.
Yeah, and we definitely see that, as we move into medieval cosmology, that there is this adoption, not just cancellation. There's this sort of this adoption of the pagan model that came before them that then gets baptized and it gets Christianized. There's a reason why we still refer to the planets by their, by Roman gods and goddesses, because the medievals didn't seem to really have a problem with doing that. They obviously don't treat them as pagan deities, but they still treat them as something like intelligences. They kind of become angels, essentially.
Yeah, so like I'm getting at like just something above yourself, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right. You're operating within a context above yourself, and there's that connection there. Now, it is. I think this is in the next section. They kind of run together for me since I haven't spent enough time with this, but the part where Odin sacrifices himself, that I find very interesting. And so we're told that at one point Odin, in seeking knowledge of the runes, he's looking for like great wisdom, essentially. He sacrifices himself to himself on Yggdrasil. Specifically, we're told he impales himself with a spear onto the tree. Again, I can't help but to think about the potential Christological connection there. That we're told he sacrifices himself to himself on the tree in order to gain wisdom. Now, obviously, that's not the Christian story, but there's enough there that I think just raises the question. It raises the topic of that connection. And I mean, also just makes me think of even the connection of the world tree, which the idea of the world tree, I mean, that's something that's not totally unique to the Norse. You can find some elements of the world tree, the tree of life, something about a cosmically significant tree in a number of different myths. And, I can't help but to connect Yggdrasil even to the cross of Christ, the tree, which reaches down into hell, but also ascends up into the heavens. And, metaphysically, it is the cosmic unifying point that brings chaos back into its proper order. It's where real life is found. And so as I look at the heart of even what the tree Yggdrasil is, again, I can't help but to see connection to the cross of Christ, in which Christ also was sacrificed, not necessarily to himself, but to God, which again, I mean, looking at a pagan parallel, it's at least pretty close. And then even impaled with a spear onto that tree. And so I think that there are a lot of strong proto-Christian symbols in these stories. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with that, but I just think it's at least interesting to think about. Now,
Yeah, absolutely.
go ahead.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's very interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, again, a lot of times people will look to these stories and try to say that Christianity isn't unique because we have a rehashing of some of these symbols. But again, as Lewis says in Myth Became Fact, that if the Christian story is true, then it would actually be a reason for more doubt if we didn't see some traces of this, elsewhere. That if this is the story, then we should expect it to be anticipated in other stories. Now, moving more directly to the sayings of the High One, or the Havamal, which is kind of like a book of Proverbs. It's about the wisdom of Odin.
Yeah, I was
yeah.
calling it as I was reading it, Odin's Rules for Life.
Yeah. And that's basically what it is. And so we've got the wisdom of Odin here coming down to us in a set of Proverbs. And so I'm interested to see what stood out to you. So, I mean, Thomas or Josh, I mean, what thoughts do you have about this text?
I was actually going to ask in general, like, do you ever find it hard to read this form of literature, whether it be like proverbial or like a series of aphorisms or anything? I'm kind of thinking of like, I think like Pascal's Pensées are like a really profound and wonderful text, but sometimes I'm like, am I like misinterpreting what he's talking about because there's just so little like context of any sort that I'm like, you know what I'm saying? Like I don't want to like misinterpret it because it's completely, almost 1,000 years removed from where I'm sitting today, and I have no idea other than like the introduction, basically. That's like a couple sentences long. Um, exactly like what this is about, or if it's about something more specific than I realize. You know what I'm saying? That makes sense.
Oh,
Yeah,
I feel like that
definitely.
with time. Oh,
No,
sorry.
no,
I
please.
was gonna say I feel like that with Thomas Aquinas all the time. I'm rereading it constantly.
Definitely. That's very fair.
Or like Marcus Aurelius, where it's just like in the Meditations, it's just like this series of aphorisms, and life advice, and and sometimes I can almost get like I'm not sure this is meant to be read like page after page from beginning to end. I think what I'm really supposed to be doing is just taking one or two of these and sitting with them for a while.
So
But that's not what I do. I just tend to read the book cover to cover and like blow through the whole thing. And I'm like, I don't think I extracted as much wisdom from that as I was meant to.
Oh,
that's fair.
yeah, I was gonna say I've had Thomas Aquinas, I've been reading it for a while, and I'm only on page 32 for that very reason.
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to a book like the Meditations, I think maybe we're supposed to meditate on it.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
as far as,
maybe
yeah, go ahead.
context isn't even like maybe like the context isn't needed. Maybe I'm overthinking it in this sense. I just kind of think even like somebody like Seneca per se, where this letter is usually like addressed to like a person, and he's like, "Hey, like you're doing this thing, and you should live in moderation, where you should be, you know, frugal and shrewd, but you shouldn't be so shrewd that you become a weirdo and like don't know how to relate to others." Like that's like I was just thinking of like an example of a letter I read recently, but it's like addressed to a person. You kind of get, oh, here's the subject matter, here's what he's talking about, and yeah, sometimes it's hard to read this. And with like the biblical proverbs, it's like I think I've been interpreting them right all this time, somewhat at least, hopefully. But having like that biblical theological context helps with that. But sometimes I'm like, huh, what am I actually understanding this right? Like, what are they talking about? And perhaps just like a deeper understanding of this culture and the like, Snorri's prose Edda and other things would even help with that as well. But yeah, just thoughts I have on my own
Yeah,
potential failings
yeah,
here.
and I think that's fair. And I don't always know what he's doing especially when he's appealing to particular like names or places I'm not familiar with. But
Right.
I feel like most of this is kind of like universal wisdom, or where you read something that doesn't seem like wisdom, you can at least figure out what cultural ideals he's presenting or speaking to. And so, there's a lot of what you find throughout the old world, especially that, there's a lot of emphasis on hospitality. There's a lot of emphasis on like you would even get in the Proverbs about not being quick to speak, but you need to listen. You need to keep your mouth shut when you don't know what you're saying. That you should be loyal to your companions. Now, perhaps unlike the Proverbs, it's also going to be a lot of emphasis on um, being a good pillager, essentially, um, which shows that they have no problem with violence. At one point it said, I don't know where it's exactly, but I think
I
it's.
was going to say when I
Go
found
ahead.
it that this was Viking, I was like, oh no.
Yeah,
But it's all
somewhere.
right because I
Go
love
ahead.
mythology, so it's fine.
But yeah, somewhere in here, again, I don't know where it is, but it says, if you want to basically kill somebody or take their stuff, make sure you get up early in the morning. It's kind of like just all in the day's work.
It's hilarious now, but it was terrible then.
For sure.
People were so frightened.
Oh yeah, here it is. It's verse 58. He should get up early, the man who means to take another's life or property. Seldom does a loafing wolf snatch the ham, nor a sleeping man victory.
Painful. Painful.
Yeah. And so there's obviously a lot in here that we're not going to take as wisdom that we should be implementing in our daily lives. But also I think there's a lot in here that is quite useful and is quite wise. For example, going back to what we've already been discussing about their relationship to mortality, we see this idea that fear of death shouldn't drive us, because that's the path of the coward. And that's what's in your attempt to hold on to your life, you're going to end up losing any life worth holding on to. And
Yeah,
so
I
I can
wrote that one
go ahead.
down. I wrote that
Mhm.
one down. It was the coward thinks he'll live forever if he flees from the battlefield, but old age won't grant him a truce, even if spears spare him.
So I actually have a sticky note if you give me one moment, and it's actually from one of the gospels stating this pretty much same thing. Hold on. So anyway, so it's Matthew 10:39, and it says, "Whoever finds his life in this world will eventually lose it through death, and whoever loses his life in this world for my sake will find it." So I think it's very interesting because there are some universal truths that are kind of like a thread that carries through, and then it finally finds its final resting place. And for me, as a Christian, in the Gospels.
Mhm. Yeah, and it makes me think of in the last battle when Jill and Eustace are talking about what they're going to do. Do we just kind of run away when it looks like everything's going downhill? And Jill says, "What's the point? We could run away and eventually we die in old age in our nursing home or whatever, or we can stand and actually make our lives worth something now." Um, and Augustine talks about this in his Contra Faustum when he's talking about kind of laying out his just war doctrine. And he's saying that the real evil of war is not the loss of life. I mean, as much as that might be a temporary tragedy, like people are going to die anyways. Right? We're dealing with mortals. He says that the real evils of war is the fact that it tends to provoke a love of violence and hatred and carnage and these sorts of things. That the real evils of war are that it tends to provoke sin. It tends to provoke that which leads to death of the soul, which is a far more serious tragedy than simply the death of our mortal lives, because we're all going to die. What matters is how we live, and that is going to be very different depending on who you are. So yeah, I think that was a great line, and a great verse here, and I just want to read it again. The cowardly man thinks he'll live forever if he keeps away from fighting, but old age won't grant him a truce, even if spears spare him. Um, Makes me think the iconic line from William Wallace in Braveheart, that all men die, but not all men truly live. And I guess that's true, and I think it's good northern wisdom here. Or and actually, the verse here right before that is also another good one. Silent and thoughtful a prince's son should be, and bold in fighting. Cheerful and merry every man should be until he comes to death. And so at the same time we're talking about the inevitability of death, it says here, be cheerful and merry, even when you're being bold and fighting. That when or it's like Chesterton said of angels, right? They can fly because they take themselves lightly. Um, so too, I think we're getting something similar here. That when you take your life lightly in relation to your mortality, you can actually enjoy it more, even when you're doing hard things.
I try to live by that.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote another one down that I also, this is not on kind of the same topic, but it said something to the effect of, everyone is someone at home, though he has but two goats and a thatch roof." I just felt that, like, one, it's like showing that, like, everybody, you know, has this kind of inherent dignity, no matter who, and what they are, and that no matter what you have, it's like the fact that you have a home, you're somebody, because, like, that there's a dignity tied to you having a home, no matter what it is, whether you're a goat herd in his hut, or like a lord in his mead hall. It doesn't matter. At home, you're king, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And there's another verse somewhere in here that hits on that theme, and I feel like easily could have been written by Marcus Aurelius when it says that
Uh-huh.
it doesn't matter if you're rich, it doesn't matter if you're poor, and your wealth or poverty doesn't necessarily have a direct relation with other people. Maybe that's just your fate. and you need to be okay with that. And so, even in a culture that does prize treasure, this is a plundering culture. At the same time, we see that the path of wisdom is not just about the accumulation of stuff. It's about finding contentment wherever you are, whatever your station is. And I think that's something good and something that we can take away.
I wonder how much of that has been lost in the kind of philosophy that you see in popular culture. I mean, I'm going to rip this right from Terminator, but there is no fate but what you make. So in our society, which is very achievement oriented, I wonder how much of that sort of contentment with your lot or contentment with the vocation God has called for you is lost by that.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, are we finding ourselves within the broader context, or are we contextualizing everything within ourselves? Is there a place for us to rest, or do we have to be Nietzsche's Übermensch, and we have to constantly go forth, basically being our own gods, forging the path as we walk on it, or do we come to find that maybe our path is already laid out for us? And I almost quoted Galadriel there, where she says, don't be overly concerned about the way that you go. Maybe your path is already before you, and basically your job is simply to discover it and to walk on it, not to forge it, not to create it. But you find the path that's already laid out for you.
Well, I would just posit to say, from my very humble station of a stay-at-home wife, that, it's kind of interesting because this has been a journey for me because I left my career. So worldly, I don't really have much of anything at all. And so I have found much contentment outside of these kind of worldly treasures for that very reason. So I would say to you, or to those listening, that whoever of you has a wife who is a stay-at-home wife is very wise in this regard, and you should probably ask and listen.
Well said.
I think that goes back to what you were saying before, Amanda, about how whoever, loses their life will find it. That, letting go of sort of worldly attitudes and priorities can help us find, what's really valuable.
It also helps us have a better understanding of truth too, I will say, because it's like it's a growth, like it's a journey, but it's like you have a better being outside, you have a better compass towards what truth is and what truth is not. Whereas sometimes you are led by your own biases when you are in kind of like the societal structure. And I just say that as someone purely from being within the structure and then being kind of outside of the structure in a certain sense, because it's like you feel as though you are compelled to speak those truths in a way that maybe you felt hindered previously.
Yeah, and along those lines, I do appreciate the emphasis we find in this text, in these proverbs, about the right kind of companionship. We get some proverbs that, in many ways, mirror the proverbs of Scripture. Like when in verse 124 here, it says, "The true mingling of kinship, when a man can tell someone all his thoughts, anything is better than to be fickle." And then, "He is no true friend who only says pleasant things." It's the wounds of a friend are better than the kisses of an enemy, as the biblical proverbs tell us. And so the sense that we need companions, we need people around us who are going to tell us the truth, who aren't going to let us get swept up in the system, or simply our own desires, or our own myopic vision, but are going to bring us into the broader context of goodness, of justice, of virtue, of faith. And then just, a little bit past that, it says here, Odin talking, he says, "I advise you, Lodfafnir, to take this advice. It'll be useful if you learn it. Do you good if you have it. Where you recognize evil, call it evil, and give no truce to your enemies." That right there is, I think, a bit of wisdom that very much counteracts what you're going to hear today. When today, I mean, everyone's saying, peace, peace where there is no peace, that we're trying to disrupt any kind of claim of goodness, of evil. This is something that I deal with constantly, teaching my public university philosophy students, that nobody wants to call anything wrong. We just want to tolerate everything. At the same time, I'll ask them, how many of you intend to vote in November? And they pretty much all raise their hands. And so then I ask them, okay, if we're just going to tolerate everything and say that nobody's right or wrong, what business do you have voting on who's going to implement a certain ideology on your neighbors? And so this postmodern radical relativism where nothing is good or evil, there is no up or down, it's not how anybody actually lives. At the same time, sometimes I'll ask my students things like, how many of you are big fans of justice? And everyone raises their hand. And then I help them understand that this doesn't make sense in light of the fact that they're telling me there's no norms for how to live, and that there's no such thing as, right or wrong, left or right. But you go back to the pagans, and yeah, maybe we say that sometimes they didn't get things right in what they called good or evil, but they don't have a problem recognizing there is such a thing as good and evil. And a mishandling of justice is a much better reality than denying justice altogether. Because at least a mishandling of justice has the potential of being made right. But when you eliminate the very foundations of justice, well, now we're in a place that none of us actually want to live in. And so I think that a lot of the pushback that we can and that we should give to postmodernism really comes down to just helping people recognize that they don't actually believe the things that they say that they believe. And helping them to at least recover the tools for calling things right or wrong, calling things evil or good. And maybe initially we don't arrive at the same definitions, but I think at least dealing with something like a standard gives us something to work with. And sometimes when you're talking to the postmodern, they're more likely to listen to pagan wisdom than explicitly Christian wisdom. But at the same time, the best of pagan wisdom is Christian wisdom.
Agreed.
But as I've been reading this, every once in a while, I'll bring in one of these proverbs as my icebreaker conversations in class at the university. Because, when you say, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some Norse pagan wisdom, I mean, that's when all these postmoderns are going to open up their ears and, they're going to think it's really interesting.
I like that. I was recently, it was this year. I read through the new edition of Tolkien's letters, the longer edition. And I was struck how hurt he was by the misuse of this mythology by the National Socialists in the 1940s. And he expresses in his letters how, like, almost more than anything else is what made him just viscerally angry at the Nazis and at Hitler was that they made Norse a dirty word, that they misused his beloved mythology for evil,
Yeah, there's that one letter where he refers to Hitler as a ruddy little ignoramus. And he's talking about how he's mishandled the Northern mythos. And, he says that, I think now at, he's middle age or whatever, I don't remember what age exactly, but he says that, at this age, as an older man, I'd be a better warrior than when I was in my 20s in combat because of, this great personal grudge I have against him.
Yeah.
And Lewis said something very similar. And said, is theology poetry, or one of his essays, when he says that it really enraged him as well that they so misused the Northern mythos. But he says, and then the Nazis really gave it all back by fundamentally misunderstanding what they were dealing with. And so Lewis says that I get much more fun with Odin, who I don't believe in, than these Nazis do through their misapprehension of this ideal.
Well, was it Lewis who said that that the Nazis think they're the heroes of the Norse myths where they're really the
monsters?
The monsters, yeah.
This is why I've stated in the past that while I would love to be one of the heroes of the Fellowship, I am but Gollum and must always crucify myself for that.
Hmm.
Yes, but hopefully you have a better ending.
Oh, we all hope for a much better ending than that.
Yes, yes. Um, No, one more thing, and this doesn't necessarily need to lead into a full conversation. But I find it interesting that you look at the biblical proverbs, and there are a lot of warnings about, don't go to the prostitute, don't go to the adulteress, that sort of thing. We get something similar, but a little bit different in the Voluspa or in the Havamal, where it says, in a witch's arm, you should never sleep, so she encloses you with her limbs. And so it's the same kind of idea, but instead of dealing with the prostitute, now we're dealing with the witch. Which I mean, I guess we're dealing with more or less the same thing. That in both contexts, we're working with the siren imagery here. But I just think it's interesting that the seductress of the Havamal is the witch who is going to consume your soul essentially, by resting with her.
I'm so sorry, but every time people say witches, I just go straight to Monty Python.
Well, anything else that you want to say about anything? It's okay if not, but I don't want to cut anyone off.
No, I would just say that I really appreciate Tolkien's sort of uplifting of this material and like kind of fully Christianizing it. Where Middle Earth is like Norse in its bones, and I just appreciate how his whole life's work was to essentially take these myths, these stories that he loved, and yet, fully infuse it with a Christian worldview, a Christian ethos. I just think that's an amazing, tribute to these stories, and also like, in a way he moves beyond them. Like even though these are like, amazing, mythological, texts that have endured for potentially thousands of years, in some way, Tolkien moves beyond them into a new space.
Yeah, definitely. He sees the logos of these stories, the true spirit of these stories, and that's what he brings out. He essentially gives us, like Gandalf comes back and says, "I'm Saruman as he should have been." Tolkien gives us the Northern mythos as it should have been. It's the fuller story, but you definitely see the shadow of that spirit in these original texts. And I think that that's what makes for good stories, especially good fantasy, but really any good story. I think it's going to be in tune with the logos that makes great stories great, that makes great literature great. And where I think a lot of people go wrong is they'll read Tolkien and then say, well, I want to go write stories like Tolkien. And so then they start writing basically knockoffs. Whereas if you want to write like a Tolkien, you want to write like a Lewis, you have to read the kinds of things that they read. You have to do the kinds of things that they did. And so uh, I think that you have to be in tune with these kinds of world shaping stories if you want to create a world shaping story.
I will say that as a writer, that is something I've begun to do myself, and which is why like I loved this opportunity to begin reading the Edda, because I realized that as a writer, that very thing, when I write fantasy, I'm very Tolkienian. And as much as I adore Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, I had this sense that I'm like, I think I need to go back to the sources though, and really like try to understand, the Lord of the Rings in context of like where it comes from, and to get these story like kind of at the taproot, of where a lot of these ideas and stuff are coming from. So I've started, I'm now dipping into Norse mythology with the Eddas. I've been all this year I've been dipping in and out of the Arthurian legendarium, the Arthurian mythos. And there's just a lot there that I can recognize where I'm like, oh, I see what he's done, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as far as just honing your own craft, as well as getting a better understanding of people like Tolkien, like Lewis, I mean, obviously, there are a lot of secondary texts on both of them that are well and good and I think are useful. But the best way to get into their minds is by doing the kinds of things that they did, reading the kinds of things that they read, which will help you to tap into that same spirit, but also go in your own direction with it, which I think is very useful to actually creating something that's really worth engaging in. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be fun to do things that are just derivative, but it won't necessarily be good, like good literature, right? It's not probably the kind of legacy that you want to create. And now at the same time, especially if you are a writer or you want to be a writer, it can also be tempting as you move into this mentality to think, I can't write anything until I read everything that's ever been written. That's definitely the temptation that I tend to move towards.
Yep, me too.
That I've never really tried to write fiction, but I have a number of things in my head that I want to work with. But I definitely have the sense of I'm not qualified until I read everything that's ever been written in the past. And of course, if that's the mentality, you're never actually going to do anything. And so it's that balance of you need to fill your mind with the right substance, but you also need to be willing to let that substance move into the places that you are meant to go with it. Find the path that's laid out for you. All right, well, cool. Anything else that anyone wants to mention before we close it off? All right. Well, I think that this was a good chat, especially for, people who are not well versed in the material, but are just exploring it along the way or just joining for the conversation. I feel like this went well, and I look forward to where we go next in the Edda. I'll look ahead and let you know what we'll be including, but next 1 or 2 sections or so. And I look forward to discussing with you next month or even in the Discord in the meantime, if you are in the Discord. But that's where we'll leave it off for now. And until next time, Godspeed. Thank you again for listening to the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you can follow along with the next conversation, which should drop in about a month or so. If you would like more regular content, you can also subscribe to the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast, and for the most content, as well as the ability to join these conversations, you can become a patron at patreon.com/mythicmind. But that's it for now. Until next time, Godspeed.